slight misapprehensions. One was that I thought I was actually going to be in a panel, in the normal sense of panel, where I would throw out a few ideas and there would be a discussion. So I'm not prepared for the equipment behind me. And the second was that I thought I was going to talk about qualitative longitudinal analysis in general, although I do say something about practices at the end. That was in a sense where I started from. And when I started from that, I thought, I'm a huge imposter. What on earth am I doing here? The only personal experience of qualitative longitudinal analysis I have really is monitoring my own life. 60 years or so. And given that I'm not very reflexive, I have a terrible memory, and I haven't kept very good records, I didn't feel that a kind of serious scientific investigation into myself would be very instructive, certainly not very scientific. So I want to start by saying I was definitely in favour of qualitative longitudinal analysis, as I understand it, because I think panel data is sociologically and social scientifically probably the nicest and the most instructive form of data, and that in-depth investigation of meaning, I will talk mostly about interviews as a source of that, is indispensable to any kind of sensible social science. However, I wanted to admit that I have never really found the quantitative-qualitative distinction to be of much help. I found sensible uses for almost all the sets of methods that have ever come my way. Clearly, methods deal with particular kinds of problems, that's certain sorts of questions, but I can never see any real reason to prioritise one over the other, and indeed, I am a principled, eclectic, use as many methods as possible, providing we answer the right kinds of questions. And I say that in the context of having just recently read a lot of literature about mixed methods, which my first conclusion was that I wouldn't advise you to read the same literature that I did on mixed methods, because I found it very uninstructive and really rather tedious. But one of the things I learned from it was that people who either propound a new paradigm of mixed methods, which has superseded qualitative and quantitative ways of doing things, and there are quite a bunch of those, trying to position that accounts on the basis of pragmatist philosophy of sorts. That didn't seem to me to be doing not much more than had been done before. But in the process, I found quite a lot of very satisfactory arguments about the indistinguishability, the reasons for not making radical separations between quantitative and qualitative methods. However, in reading that, the problem raised, which is if you do use lots of different methods, how do you put them together? How do you integrate methods, which is one of the driving forces of that literature, seemed to me entirely appropriate as a question about how, as social scientists generally, we should be operating. And in that sense, in terms of joining methods together, I came up with one practical proposal in relation to qualitative longitudinal analysis, and that was actually to give kind of standard surveys to your qualitative interviewees, as well as doing what you would normally do. I mean, it may be that people do that already, but I have a very strong reason for wanting to suggest that would be useful, which actually relates to a study I did with Mike Savage, Tony Bennett and Elizabeth Silver, a little bit before he worked on the NCRM, and that was a study of cultural consumption in the UK, where we collected data by standard survey methods about people's tastes in cultural activities of various sorts. And we used, I'm glad you showed it on the screen, multiple correspondence analysis after the manner of Bourdieu to find patterns in the data. And then we did what you've done this time, which was do some in-depth interviews with some of the people who had been surveyed, and because of the way that the software now operates, you can actually isolate the individuals, as was done on the screen before, and you have the sociologically huge advantage, I think, of being able to position the people who you know an awful lot about, whose meanings you've interrogated, whose lives you know a good deal more about than you would otherwise, in a social structure, in a structured group, in this case, national context. And I found that particular combination of qualitative and quantitative techniques to be, I mean, it's not me to judge whether it's actually instructive. You read the analysis and wonder whether that was the case or not. But it seemed to me that what it did was to allow not only it be possible to relate kind of positions to dispositions, which is a standard sort of sociological technique in relation to using survey data, but also you could ask people about their situations, the contexts in which they were acting and operating, which seems to me to be the third essential leg of a proper sociological account. So, in a sense, you want to know why some people, what it is that made these two exceptional persons in Mike's account exceptional. And you can actually do that using those kinds of techniques. And what I thought that did was to increase one of the nicest articles I read about mixed methods was by Nigel Fielding, where he basically says the advantage of using more than one of the distinctive techniques is to get analytic density. So it's not triangulation, because you can't actually measure exactly the same things with different techniques. It's not a question of just using some numbers to illustrate a condition, or some quotations to illustrate what people in a group like this do. But that is a way of understanding more thoroughly, giving better explanations, pulling together analytically the results of one study. And what I learned, I think, from this reviewing the mixed methods literature was that our problem is not so much that we don't have decent methods. I think we've got lots of really pretty good methods, methodological techniques. What we're not so good at is writing the rules or the protocols or the instructions for how you put them together, how you write interpretations of the data. Because it seems to me that you have the same problem interpreting quantitative and qualitative data. You have to, in the end, write a story about some of the relevant sociological connections. And that's really the problem, and that we tend to spend a lot more time doing things that are lesser problems. Because the subclause in my contract was about practices, I gave a little bit of thought to that too. And the thing about theories of practice is that the injunction is to take practices as the unit of analysis rather than persons. So what we've talked about so far is that persons perform a very nice bridge between quantitative and qualitative data in the way that Mike used it in one, or we used it in cultural capital and social exclusion. And as listening to Andrew's paper this morning, I was thinking the unit of the event might be exactly the sort of thing that a practice theoretic account could indeed use. The issue for practice theory is how people who aren't in the same situations do nevertheless tend to conduct their activities in a similar kind of way. And you could give some accounts of, I guess, how those things were learned. But people clearly don't behave in performances are very differentiated. And the issue is how those practices change over time. And actually, the account of events made it seem. I think the solution to that is to take performances as the unit of analysis. Literally, how something is done, procedures and standards, and to take individuals simply as being the bearers of those kinds of practices. And that's the theoretical claim. And it's a way of trying to get somewhere between a kind of holistic and totalistic account. Society makes people do this, or individuals make decisions and are thoroughly in control of their destinies. And the 1980s, through practice theory, through to Shatsky, would say we should be looking at the practices and not at individuals. And it seems to me that one would write that kind of story using a wide range of different sorts of data. And the things that I would imagine are things that come out of archives. It's a little bit of a wide question of what is it that steers the behaviour in the present. And it's struck me things like handbooks, family photographs, objects and technologies as they develop over time, but expenditure records, reports, testimonies, manuals about how to do a certain kind of thing, all give some kind of account of why it might be that different individuals do the same practice in a different kind of way, and that the practice itself can be seen to be developing over time. I wasn't quite sure where I thought a qualitative longitudinal analysis would certainly wouldn't be precluded, but it wouldn't have any necessary priority in that context. But that seemed to be we've introduced the issue about how you put things together. So I have three very trite conclusions really. One is that on the basis of my encounter with the mixed methods literature, we should spend much more time looking at how to analyse and interpret results rather than how to collect data. Secondly was my suggestion that surveys be administered to people in qualitative surveys in order that it's possible to put individuals on a social map, because it works in the inverse way, as was described by Mike. And the other was simply the thought that qualitative longitudinal analysis is in some ways, as far as I can see, mostly another way of doing interviews. Actually, survey interviews and in-depth interviews are, I would argue, on a continuum. Obviously, you can analyse them in different kinds of ways. That probably would be the strongest argument for the big difference between qualitative and quantitative approaches. But actually, I tend to think of them as being not certainly not mutually exclusive, and the more that our data can be used at both levels of granularity, the better.
That's great. Thanks, Alan. Three nice papers which have provided kind of quite different perspectives on QR law. It's all quite useful, I think. So thank you, away. Any questions for Alan, or comments, or Natasha?
Yes, hi. I was very interested to hear you talk about practices, but I wonder how that sits with your urge, for example, for us to use surveys or indeed interviews as well. And I'm wondering whether you don't think that the ontological presuppositions that are built into, for example, the interview method or the survey, are actually completely different to taking the theoretical idea of practices of our ontological meta-analysis and turning that into methods. So I think there's a tension there, and I wonder whether that's how you see it as well.
I mean, there is, yes, I agree. I mean, a lot of practice theory, when put into practice, is actually microsociology. And in that regard, it does seem sensible to use observation and ethnographic techniques a lot, but arguably not exclusively. If the proposition is that performances are kind of just instances of a practice, you also need to know something about the nature of the practice itself. And I don't think you necessarily get that from observation or talking to small numbers of individuals. You get it from, say, from documents, from looking at the development of technologies, and also can be got from asking people kind of what they think, what their standards are in relation to a particular practice. So my argument would be, yes, particularly from micro-sociological kind of uses of practice theory, some of these techniques are not the best, maybe not preferred ones, maybe not optimal. Certainly for some kind of questions, but for others, it seems to be entirely. I mean, if practices are about understandings as well as procedures and purposes, I think understandings aren't necessary just derived from satisfaction.
I think that's a useful clarification. Any more questions? Comments?
It was just on that point actually. But wouldn't an ethnography be that? You would look at the documentary evidence and look at the tools and techniques surrounding it. Or say ethnomethodology, and that would very much be about looking at those aspects.
That would certainly make a very significant contribution, but I'm simply saying that I don't think that's necessarily exclusively the only way to do that, because of the social embeddedness of the activity, I suppose.
Any more questions? Comments?
Oh, great. I really like what you said about mixed methods. I'm sure it seems to me, we have these sort of story or debate between qual and quant, and we can have another one between the mixed methods advocates and the rest. And I think we're going to start, looking at spectrums. You've got to allow for several methods at one end and mix at the other, and any kind of combination of them, because that's what we're doing is mixing up questions and mixing up data in very creative ways and creating methods to address particular questions. That's a much more productive way forward for me than I would. So I really like what you see.
Yeah, that's great.
Just extending what you said there, one of the interesting things from the mixed methods debate, and the thing we tried to incorporate when interpreting the NCDS data is this idea of contradictory data. The whole idea that not only can be a validation, but nevertheless in an apparent contrast can give you a way of reinterpreting a statement, which is really where that business of how people tell their stories, where that argument came from, and structure and something to be able to anchor or not. So that it was just making these things rub against each other. This is really useful. But I agree with you. Much more needs to go on to that, into that element of it, into that actually bringing those things together rather than just the different collection processes and what they do.
Which I guess is one of the challenges of our step change project. It was quite nice hearing Alan's maybe it's a good idea to do surveys alongside kind of qualitative research, because I guess one of our plans for the step change transport project that we talked about this morning is to ask our kind of panel of respondents to fill in a standard national transport survey or some other kind of standard transport survey anyway as part of the kind of process, so that we will be able to somehow, hopefully, link our sample and record our sample. That's great. Thank you very much, Alan, for that.